to pieces or something like that. But anyway, after all this happened, 4 books survived, and they weren't even discovered until the late 18th and early 19th century. Of course, the Dresden Codex, which you mentioned, was found in Dresden, and the Paris Codex was found in the library in the French Bibliothèque. And there's 2 books, well as the Madrid Codex, which they think was actually a war trophy brought home by Cortez, the head of the conquistadors, to his family in Spain. And then there was the one found in the 1880s in a cave in Chiapas. That's called the Grolier. It's probably the one that's in worst shape. So there's 4, but the one of them is most important. The one book that is most important, the Codices, is the Grolier, with all its unbelievable mathematics and calendars and periodic charts of different planets and the sun, eclipses of the moon. And you're correct. That was the big book.
And so all of these are considered the codices. Is that right? All
yes.
4 of these books? Okay. And then within each book are their diagrams and their ways of teaching as far as astronomy and things that they were able to construct and all of that. Is that right? Like each book is a different set of instructions or information. Is that correct?
That's correct. But
okay.
mostly they deal with astronomy. For somehow about this book's got away. Although the priests who were befriending the Maya intellectuals back during the conquest read books and saw books that dealt with natural history and medicine and history itself. One priest describes a book that had 800 years of history into it. And so it had a whole range of books like you would find in a modern library. And there were, some say hundreds, some say thousands were burned at Mani in the famous Auto de Fe in 1562, I think. So
and there's such a tragedy in the burning of such incredible material that would have definitely changed our lives. I'm certain. But we go back into the Mayan brain and the Mayan theories and what really triggered them. And it seems that the Mayans were quite obsessed with time and the timing of things. And it also came through that they looked at time both as a linear concept and a cyclic concept. Can we talk a little bit about why the Mayans may have been so obsessed with time? And then I would like to get into the wobble period and their calendar after that. Okay.
Let's go back. We're talking about 3,000 year, 2,900 year. We've rounded off to 3,000. 3,000 year civilization. It's the longest in history. Of course, there was no one to invade them because they were not an empire. They were 50 independent city-states that supported each other, and sometimes with war, but somebody else would come in and help out, and things would go back to civility again. But that was one of the elements, in my opinion, that made them last so long, was the fact they had a stable political history. And they had a very large trade business going with all the civilizations north and south of the area. So when they started becoming a civilization, let's start back in the early pre-classic. Can you imagine how clear the sky was in those days? I mean, a transparent, crystal clear sky at night. And this was the day before electric lights and all the smog and everything, so they could look into the heavens. And I know you've experienced this feeling of being in a very clear area where you could look at the stars and just feel like you could almost touch them. They feel so close. Right. So they had this unbelievable feeling of being close to the cosmos. And after centuries and maybe a millennium of studying the stars and becoming familiar with them, they begin to name them and time the wanderers, the planets, Mercury and Venus and Mars, etc. And they had names, and they wanted a count. So you could see where the need for mathematics and astronomy and a written way of record keeping would rise up out of this intellectual crowd that was looking at the stars. But also, by timing all these things, we get to the time. They got into space and time and developed what is known as the quadripartite cosmic philosophy. They had divided the cosmos into 4 elements, 4 quadrants, and the 4 parts were represented in time as the 3 dimensions of, like in trigonometry or geometry or calculus, X, Y, and Z. And they added time as a factor T. So they had a 4-dimensional look at time, and they were obsessed with it. And as you said, they had linear time, they had cyclic time. They looked at time as undifferentiated, past, present, and future. And they were very interested in the quality as well as the quantity of time. The quality is past and present. Now, when they calculated time, they looked at these 4 dimensions, which is very similar to the modern concept of the space-time continuum, where you actually have the ability to place an event not only in time but in space. And that was an amazing concept. But this, you see how we're getting into a cognitive thought process here? About time and about space and about the Earth and the stars and what they meant to the Maya. They became a belief concept, not a religion so much, but they used these time elements to go back to find a similar event and then cycle forward and place a time in the future when they would plan important events like coronations, wars, etc. Sometimes they were called Star Wars because they predicted the dates by using the stars. But the amount of time, and that's obsession with time, made them special and grew the sciences, the mathematics, the astronomy, and the one of the 5 original written languages in the world. That's a big factor. That plus the fact they were the best astronomers in the world. I mean, every calculations of the periodicities, the rotation of the sun, Venus, and Mars, and cycles of the moon were within seconds of our modern calculations. So they were really smart and really good, and they worked at it a long time. And I keep using time as an element because look what, today they had a ceremony for Neil Armstrong, the first man to walk on the moon. That was almost 50 years ago. I mean, that was before we were 2 centuries old, and we're talking about a 30th century civilization. Just think what we could do with, correcting mistakes, going back and starting again, trial and error, any way you want to think of it. But they got it right in the end. And they, because they got it right, they started building up these classes. They had the scientists, the elite. They had the ruling class, elite. They had religious class, elite. They needed better buildings. They needed cities. They needed functional spaces to work in. And and with the need for cities and the growth of the population, here comes the need for technology and tool making, making cement, and collecting and saving water during the rainy season so it could be used for the cities and for the farms during the dry season. And on with their roads and their bridges, et cetera, which you mentioned a few of these. So that brings us up to date on the time because they were really driven by time, and we see that in the interest that people have taken in their record keeping and dates. They were unbelievable with dates, chronicling an event, past, future, etc. And we're lucky they were carved on monuments like stela. These are the large, let's call them billboards that they have out in the plazas. and they survived where the books did not, except for a few. And they give us a real good look at the Maya and their thought of time. And that's where this date, 13.0.0.0, came from as the end of the current world period, as they call it, or creation. It depends on who you're talking to, what they call the 5 periods that they derive from the wobble of the Earth. And does that take us to the calculation of the precession of the Earth now?
Well, now you know they have this each section at 25,800 years, which, like you were just saying, the next period ends in our calculation December 21st, 2012, and there's been so much hype for so many years that be prepared for the doomsday, be prepared for all of these fear-induced concepts that have run rampant all over in regard to 12/21/2012. Now, the Mayans didn't look at the changing of the calendar as an end of a period. Is that correct? They looked at it as a dawning, didn't they?
Well, it was like our Y2K. When we came close to the end of the first millennium, second millennium rather, and 1999 came up, everybody was predicting terrible things, and we had the computer to worry about. We were all said the computers are all going to not function because of the ability to change over the numbers, et cetera, and planes are going to fall from the sky. I remember all the things.
Right. But we were all fearful.
I kept track of the geologic data and the records because being a structural engineer, I'm an expert in earthquakes. And NASA. And I still get 4 or 5 updates every day on NASA. So let's take us to the Maya first, okay?
Okay.
Actually, I hate to correct you, but it was 25,800 for the whole circle of precession. They broke into 5 pieces, which were 5,126 years and 8 days. Not to be picky, but that's a big difference between the two. So the whole cycle was 25,600, and each of the 5 creations was 5,126 years or so. So can you imagine when they finally broke the code, someone went back around 500 BC, let's say, or 300 BC. We don't know when they amazingly came up with this number for the total cycle of precession. So let's just say you and I, or we're 2 Maya astronomers, and we say we broke the code. We got it now. This time we checked it out. It is 25,800. We've divided into 5 parts, and there's 5 parts that are 5,123 years and 128 days. Good. And when I'm looking at it, so when did this start? When does it end? Now, this is not a joke. This is probably the way. Because I've been involved in those science that figure out that, oh, hey, we found it. Where did it come from type of thing, okay? So they had established a beginning and an end. And they knew that it had to be before they could track time back. So they probably maybe said, let's say we're in the middle now, okay? So they went, they went forward because they knew they'd already picked an end date. And they picked a time, and they really knew how to unbelievably predict the periodicities and the movement of the stars and the Milky Way and the Venus planets. So they picked a time that would be really good. Hey, let's pick the first of the year. Let's pick New Year's. You may not know this, but December 21st is not only the winter solstice, but it is also the New Year in the Maya calendar. So they picked New Year in 2012. And in 2012, the Black Rift, that they call the womb of the Milky Way, would be somewhere over the primary zenith of the sun on the first day of winter, and the winter solstice. And this is the way the scientists explained to me. So we got to go back and reconstruct this. They could do that. They knew that the cycle of the Earth and cycle of the. So they picked a day in 2012, and they picked a day that was where the womb is, or the Black Rift would be directly over the sun at noon or whatever they called midday. And And that's how they picked the day, in my opinion, okay, because that's the scientific